It is November 11th, 2025, and as you may have seen, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, the former leader of al-Qaeda in Syria, was paraded around the White House on Monday as he met with President Trump, as he went to the IMF headquarters, and as the US made it clear that this was their guy. This is their guy in Damascus. But what does Jolani's position as the US and Israeli puppet in Syria mean for tensions in the region, especially when you factor in Russia, who has also been courting him, especially when you factor in Turkey, who helped him become the leader that he is to begin with. And when you look at all of those different competing interests, and then also the question of what it means for the Syrian people at the end of the day, because the war that we've seen for the last several years is not over. The pain and suffering is not over for the Syrian people. And today we got into all of that and more with a special guest who knows life in Syria firsthand. So let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is independent journalist and geopolitical analyst Vanessa Beeley. Vanessa, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
No, thank you for inviting me on. It's nice to be back with you.
Yeah, it's always good to have you on the show. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here because I know that Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, the former ISIS prodigy, leader of al-Qaeda in Syria, he was just paraded around Washington and treated like a world leader as he agreed to join the anti-Islamic State coalition, claiming that his past was in the past. So, what is your
Uh-huh.
reaction? Was there anything in this visit that surprised you?
Not really. As someone pointed out to me the other day, I think I'd posted something and they messaged me and said, I think you've got Jolani fatigue, like all of us have got, because he's just being paraded everywhere from the Kremlin to the UN, the UNGA. Now, of course, he's in the United States and at the White House. I think one thing you said was really interesting because I was checking up this afternoon. The government is not actually recognized. Like everyone is kind of assuming it is because of the way that he is being entertained, let's say, in all of the official circles within the so called international community. But actually, the government itself is unrecognized, even by the United States. That was confirmed back in April, and that hasn't yet been rescinded. So, what this appears to me is that the United States, in fact, all of the players in Syria, are effectively pulling Jolani in all different directions, giving him instructions as to what he must do in order to basically attain this recognition. Of course, as Ahmed al-Sharaa, has had the sanctions lifted from him in the UN very recently, as did Anas al-Khattab, the former head of intelligence for Al-Qaeda in Idlib, and now, of course, Minister of Interior with very close connections to Turkish intelligence. Both of them had the UN sanctions lifted off them before they went to the US. But the fact is, I think I didn't see, I'd be interested in your take because I didn't really see a man of power. I mean, number one, he was brought in through the Western Executive Avenue, so not in through the main Western driveway, which is kept for world leaders. So clearly, again, that's a clue to the fact that the government is still not officially recognized. But he looked like an employee of Trump in all of the images that I saw, right? You know, when they're all four of them sitting in front of Trump and he's sitting there like this, like a schoolboy. And we know perfectly well he's not going to the United States as a world leader. He's going to the United States as a puppet of the United States to receive his instructions. Very similar to Zelensky. There's very little difference between them in their demeanor and how they're being treated by the United States. And we'll come on to the reality of whether sanctions have, in fact, been lifted or not.
Yeah, that's a really good point and interesting too. I did not think about that entrance, but yeah, as I was watching all of this play out, and even just the video that was put out before the official visit where he was playing basketball with US military personnel, I guess, I was looking at that and going, that's not how a world leader would act. It literally is like their guy. And it's so funny to me that all of these media reports are like, oh, yeah, remember that one time that he was in jail that the US
Yeah, and
initially got him? And
Petraeus
I'm
was
like,
visiting him for 5 years and then described himself as being one of his biggest fans, remember, in the interview between Petraeus and Jolani. So, I mean, it's very clear that this guy was their asset from Camp Bucca onwards, regardless of whether he was with ISIS in Iraq and he then created Al-Qaeda. He was one of the co-founders of Al-Qaeda in Syria. And of course, Assad al-Shaibani, who accompanied him, was one of the other co-founders, as was the defense minister that has also just come back from Moscow. But what I find quite interesting, again, I was looking into this today, was the meeting with the IMF, because about a month ago, the reports from the Syrian media were saying, no, Jolani is not going to accept an IMF bank loan. He's not looking for flotation by the IMF or by the World Bank. And in fact, about 2 weeks ago, the finance minister, the Takfiri regime finance minister, was saying that they were not going to be looking for any help from the IMF because they were going to look for that help from Moscow. Right. So they were talking back then after the dual visits. In fact, there have been many visits by the various members of Jolani's regime, but the latest ones of Jolani himself and then of the defense minister. And we can again talk about that. So at the moment, what I'm seeing is this kind of competing for influence in Syria by Russia and the United States. And clearly the photo op that Jolani did with the head of the IMF is a bit of, in my opinion, it's a slap to Moscow saying, we're going to debt enslave Syria, not Moscow, right? So in my view, there is a big power play going on in Syria. There is, of course, in that process, the risk of partitioning Syria also. And that brings us onto the arrival of American troops to Damascus, which I think you mentioned to me before we spoke.
Yeah, and we've got those reports of the US wanting to establish an airbase in Damascus, and that was kind of being put out there before al-Jolani had even arrived in Washington. And I think you bring up a really good point too about the competing influence, because this is nothing new for Syria, right? We know that the US has had their eye on this country for a while. We know that Russia has also had their eye on it, and it has also had a lot of involvement. So as we are, of course, coming up on the 1 year anniversary of the coup against Assad, how do you view that competing influence in Syria? I know Jolani and his thugs are kind of really playing into it, as you were noting, right? They're like, sure, we'll go to Russia. Sure, we'll go to the IMF headquarters. But what does that actually look like for Syria?
Well, it's kind of interesting because, of course, since, as you said, the coup in December 2024, we're coming up to 1 year. Israel effectively has control of the south. They've encroached on Syrian territory beyond the occupied Golan territory. They're now building separation walls in the south. They've basically said, as part of the security agreement that Trump is supposedly negotiating in the US with Jolani between Israel and Syria, that there should be no militarization in the south of any kind whatsoever. Jolani, of course, has been allowing his Takfiri and Bedouin thugs to massacre the Druze in the south in Sweda province in order to basically provide the environment in which Israel can come in as the protector and basically take control of Sweda through settlement and through infiltration of the Druze society there, because not all of the Druze are pro-Israel. So, to some degree, they're having to create the environment in which the Druze go, okay, like, we would prefer to have Israel than to have the Takfiri elements massacring us, right? And if you look at, from the beginning of the coup, Israel took control of Mount Hermon, which is the highest point, the most strategic point on the border between Lebanon and Syria, to the southwest of Damascus. America already has its base at Al Tanf, which is to the southeast of Damascus on the border with Iraq and Jordan. Now it's talking about coming in and creating an American presence at the gateway to the south. So at the southernmost area of Damascus, basically forming a line between Mount Hermon and Al Tanaf that separates the south completely from Damascus, and which will then become a demilitarized zone, with the United States offering surveillance and intelligence for Israel. At the same time, of course, Russia is pushing to be allowed to go to the south as a kind of UNIFIL operation in order to effectively prevent Israeli expansionism. But I'm afraid I'm a little bit cynical about that, because I don't really see how Russia's going to prevent any expansionism from Israel when Syria is effectively under the influence of the United States. At the same time, since the defense minister's visit, which came after Jolani's visit to the Kremlin, there are rumors, and I've heard that also from people inside Syria and from Syrians living in Russia, that Russia will consolidate its base on the coast, but also extend into Hamar and Homs, close to the northern border with Lebanon. Now, on the positive side, this means potentially that some of the Syrians that fled to Russia during the coup will be able to come back if they're given some guarantees by Russia that the Takfiri elements are going to be pushed out of the coastal area completely. At the same time, of course, again, this couldn't happen without green light from both Israel and Turkey, and ultimately by Washington, because Washington has control of the Syrian landscape now. The fact that Russia is able to expand and extend its influence from the coast to the northeast and to the south is indicative of warming relationship between Trump and Putin, in my opinion.
Interesting. That is a take that I don't know that I've heard yet. And it's also interesting, too, when you look at the landscape, the fact that the US is still fighting a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. And so I'm curious, too, when it comes to Syria. I mean, I guess it would have been expected initially that the US would try to push out any sort of Russian influence altogether, right? That they would be like, get the Russians out of their bases. We want to take them over. So, what do you make of the fact that, I mean, is it that the US doesn't want to fully deal with all of the control in Syria, that they know that there are a lot of different elements there? Or is it that they look at Russia and they say, they're not a threat to us, kind of let them do what they want in these specific locations, because they don't think that Russia would target the US or it? I mean, clearly they're not going to target Jolani and his death squads and everyone that is there in Damascus.
I think it's a combination, and I think of what you just suggested, but I think also in the beginning, the US effectively was lobbying Jolani to get rid of the Russians, to kick the Russians out entirely. Then, of course, Israel stepped in and was lobbying for Russia to stay, because Russia presents an addition to Israel's efforts to prevent Turkish expansionism. Because for Israel, it's incredibly important that Erdogan is contained. Erdogan sees or believed that in enabling the fall of Damascus, he would effectively be given Syria on a plate, a unified Syria, as a kind of Turkish protectorate. Of course, he fell into a trap, basically. Because the reality is that Israel, which of course is allied with Washington, and so therefore Israel is always going to be prioritized over Turkish national aspirations, perceived that Turkey should have the lion's share of the control of Syria, including the south, the eastern corridor, David's corridor, that would join up with the Kurdish factions in the northeast, that of course are at the same time the nemesis of the Turks, right? So it's a very difficult balancing act that is going on at the moment. I think that Russia is effectively setting itself up as the kind of, again, as it did under President Assad, as the neutral mediator, because it can mediate between the Turks and the Kurds. It has a presence again in Qarmishli. It didn't really leave it, but it left a kind of skeleton staff there. Now it's increasing its personnel, it's increasing its hardware in the northeast. the same on the coastal areas, but it can also contain Turkey. It can prevent the expansion to the northeast and into central Syria. And if you look at how the times that Turkey has tried to expand, it's tried to provide air defense to Jolani and military personnel in central Syria, which was immediately bombed by Israel, immediately before they even got established. So it's very, very clear from the beginning. Israel saw Russia as an opportunity to basically hold back Turkish interests or contain Turkish interests. Russia sees it as a great opportunity to consolidate its interests in Syria, not lose its interests in Syria, maintain its coastal bases, which are incredibly important for Russia for its access to Africa and its interests in Africa. Otherwise, it would be very reliant on Turkish airspace and Turkish, let's say, help in enabling it to bring its cargo planes and so on into Africa. So it's kind of a win-win for Russia to some degree.
Yeah, it's interesting as you're laying it out there because I'm thinking about the fact that, yeah, I mean, Russia gets to keep their presence, but at the same time, they don't have kind of this burden of, I don't know if they necessarily felt like they were holding everything together, but at least helping hold everything together, right? Playing a role.
No, they don't have the responsibility anymore, the military responsibility. It depends also how it ends up, because France is also pretty interested in the coastal area. That's another reason perhaps that Russia is kind of digging in there. There are a number of players in Syria that are circling around each other and trying to find compromise and ways to kind of trick each other into being given greater influence in Syria. So to some degree, I won't say I feel sorry for Jolani because it's impossible to feel sorry for effectively someone that is enabling and facilitating mass atrocities for the last 15 years against the Syrian people, which has actually escalated since he took control because, of course, they were disarmed. There's no Syrian army left. And the thugs under his control are massacring people, not only in the coastal areas and in Sweden in the south, but even now in Damascus. They're now calling for the expulsion of the Shia Muslims from Damascus, from Sayyidah Zainab, one of the most holy shrines for Shia Muslims. But even moderate Sunnis now are under attack. If they're not prepared to comply with the Takfiri regime ideology, then they also are being targeted. Christians. So, I don't have any sympathy for him. But to some degree, when you look at the number of powers that are pulling him in all directions, and that includes even internally, because now, as you said, he's joined this anti-ISIS coalition. Well, how does this work? This is literally cannibalizing his own forces, right? Because probably, I don't know the percentages, but I would guess between 30 to 40% of his forces are either foreign Takfiris or are more or closer to the ISIS ideology, to that very extremist ideology. And they're basically seeing him betray them. So at some point, also internally, there is going to be a huge backlash against him, particularly if he now goes down the route of rooting out ISIS operatives and so on. There are claims, by the way, that he is doing so. There was quite a funny report recently where apparently he'd arrested one of the leaders, but he'd already arrested him when he was in charge of the suicide bombing at one of the Christian churches in Damascus a few months ago, and then released him. So everyone's kind of laughing at him, saying, well, you arrested him before, you must have released him because now you've arrested him again. So it's theater to a large degree because he can't afford to alienate the ISIS elements within his fighting groups, basically.
Yeah, I'm glad that you bring that up because I was wondering about that too. I'm like, okay, you relied on all of these guys. You are one of these guys. And now, he can come, he can sit down with Fox News and tell them, "Oh, that's all in my past, right? Don't worry, I'm a changed man now." But he's really not at the end of the day. And I am curious too, as you were describing it, I'm looking over at Turkey and going, okay, does there come a point when Turkey goes, wait a second, we made you, right? We made the al-Jolani that you know today. We gave you this power. And now you're over here. You're going to the IMF headquarters. You're going to the White House. You're going to Russia. No, no, no. We are going to come in and to try to exert some sort of influence and power over him. Do you see there being more internal struggles when it comes to those external forces, like, say, Turkey, or are they likely to kind of stay backed off?
No, absolutely, definitely. There's going to be clashes internally, and we're almost heading towards a similar scenario, of course, to Lebanon, which is very much divided since the Taif Agreement of 1989, which basically, divided the country politically into sectarian factions. And Turkey has control of what is now known as the Syrian National Army, the SNA, which holds most of the northern territory down to the city of Aleppo and much of the countryside of Aleppo. And there have, I think, already been clashes, particularly between the Kurdish factions, of course, and Jolani's HTS forces. But the SNA was effectively the Free Syrian Army that was then adopted by Turkey and turned into the Syrian National Army, which is predominantly Syrian, as far as I know, whereas many, as I said, of Jolani's forces are foreign, like the Uyghurs, the Chechens, the Kazakhstanis, the Tajikistans, and so on. And so there is a very strong possibility that ultimately there will be clashes between the former Free Syrian Army that also have factions within Jolani's army, if you want to call it that, right? So yeah, there's a very strong possibility that eventually Syria is going to head towards the same direction as Lebanon, where it's going to be divided into statelets that are controlled either by external powers using the internal forces as proxies, or by internal forces that have kind of gathered behind their sect and have created enclaves where they warlord over it. And then that becomes basically another form of informal partitioning.
Okay, I think that's a really important point to keep in mind as we go forward, because especially as you got the US going, oh, yeah, we want to be friends with Syria again, right? We want to lift some sanctions, maybe allow some IMF to get funding in there to a certain degree. And it's like, yeah, you get more and more influences in there. And then that, of course, leads to more tensions. The last thing I wanted to bring up is just what this means for the people of Syria, right? The average members of the public, the minorities especially, who are living through all of this on a day-to-day basis and have no real control over what is happening to their country. What are your concerns for the people of Syria moving forward?
I mean, there's huge concerns. I still have friends in Syria. I have some that I've completely lost contact with. I don't know if they've been kidnapped, killed, because it's too dangerous to try and contact them, because obviously if they have been kidnapped, the last thing they want to see is someone externally messaging them and so on. So it's a very difficult situation. Financially, they're doing really badly, far worse than even during the hardest years under sanctions prior to the fall of the Syrian government. But also, when you talk about the lifting of sanctions, that's also a bit of it's a bit of a fraud, because actually what Trump has done, they can't lift the Caesar sanctions, which are the most draconian of the sanction measures, until it's repealed by Congress. So what he's done is waive the sanctions for 6 months or another 6 months. Well, this doesn't create an environment of security within the company from an economic perspective. Investors are not going to invest if there's a risk of sanctions being reinstated, if, for example, Jolani doesn't go along with all of the US recommendations, right? And what it leads to are fire sale concessions. So, in other words, doing deals at a far lower rate or a lower value than they should be doing, just in order to keep the economy afloat. It increases the possibility of debt, which at the same time means that prices remain static. Jobs are not increasing because the investment is not coming in. And Jolani has already laid off a huge number of people, the majority within those ethnic minorities that he's targeting. he's moving Takfiri elements into their homes. So he's resettling the Takfiri, both foreign and Syrian, into these areas that previously held the ethnic minorities that are now displaced, either outside Syria or living in sort of poverty elsewhere. So there's no jobs. Prices are static, although no one's earning anything. Shortages are tremendous, even fuel shortages, because the Kurds still have control of the oil sector in the northeast, right? And they're not fully integrated into Jolani's forces yet, or into the centralized government yet. And they're very unlikely to be. So they're holding the oil hostage. So Jolani has nothing at the moment. No one's really come forward with the promises they made, like Qatar was supposed to be sending ships to provide electricity. As far as I know, they haven't come. The so-called gas deal from Azerbaijan is not really materializing. So, you know what I mean? Like, no one feels, I see it as an Iraq landscape post 2003 when Paul Bremer was allegedly bringing in all these investors into Iraq. Where did all the money go? And Tom Barrack is doing exactly the same thing now. All of these facade companies, these shell companies are coming in with all these promises of building metros and Damascus towers and all these things that the people really don't need, but there's no money behind them. All of these companies, when I looked into them, most of them are shell companies or, established like literally a month before they came to Damascus, and they don't have the backing to provide the billions in investment that they're claiming to be able to. Saudi Arabia is just basically putting in its footprint, waiting for everything to settle, and then it can step in and say, yes, but I already, I put my investment pledge here. I didn't invest anything, but this is what I said I would invest in, right? So the people are suffering. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And of course, security is at an all-time low. The streets are lawless. The amount of theft and petty theft and rape and abduction of women and so on is ongoing in all of the cities. And this was never, even during, the worst times of the war, security was never as bad as this. This is someone that spent considerable time in Syria, both during the main wartime and then during the last 5 years when sanctions bit really hard and people were living in very desperate poverty. But there was never a lack of security. There was never a lack of healthcare. There is now, so society is being torn apart internally, but no one's paying any attention externally because they're all playing a much bigger game of control and influence, and no one is really paying any attention to the very real suffering of the Syrian people now.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you bring that up because I think that that's something that is so lacking here in the media, especially in the West, right? They will give you the headlines and say, oh, Trump lifted these sanctions, or yeah, this and this country pledged this amount of money, but then they never really look at what life is actually like on the ground, what the consequences of all that is happening on the geopolitical stage are for the Syrian people. And that's what truly matters at the end of the day. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest. I really appreciate the work that you're doing here. Independent journalist and geopolitical analyst Vanessa Beeley. Y'all be sure to check out her work at beeley.substack.com. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
No, thank you so much, Rachel.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.